The night was dark, the campfire dancing in the silence, but the atmosphere between Frank and Blackjack was anything but peaceful. They sat on a log, holding the simple boxes of rations that had become familiar to both of them throughout this trip. Their conversation, at first casual, gradually turned to a topic that neither of them could agree on. Frank, his eyes blazing, stopped chewing, put down the box of rations, and spoke. "Listen, Blackjack," he began, his voice low but clear, as if to make sure every word was engraved. "We'd be fools to tell LaFay. He'd give us a little bit, a small payday. But we're sitting on a treasure. Think about it. We could have endless wealth for the rest of our lives." Blackjack didn't answer right away. He looked down at the ground, the firelight reflecting off his calm but determined face. Finally, he turned to Frank, his gaze heavy as if to emphasize every word he was about to say. "Frank," Blackjack said slowly, his voice thoughtful, "lying here is morally wrong. I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and morally bankrupt." Frank stared at him as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Moral? Blackjack, are you serious?" Frank laughed angrily, his voice growing louder. "What do you think LaFay will do for us? He cares about nothing but lining his own pockets. You want to sacrifice everything for someone like that?" Blackjack raised his head, his eyes no longer calm but determined. "Not for LaFay, Frank. I'm not doing this for him. I'm doing this for myself. I don't want to look in the mirror every day and see a liar." The discussion quickly escalated. The two stood up, facing each other, their screams echoing through the night. Frank, his eyes red with rage, pointed at Blackjack, who just stood there, refusing to back down. "What's wrong with taking what's ours?" Frank shouted, his voice echoing through the darkness. "Ours? That's cheating, Frank." Blackjack snapped back, his eyes as sharp as knives. "Greed will destroy us." As the tension reached its peak, Blackjack finally raised his hand, as if to end it all. "Enough," he said, his voice a command. Without waiting for Frank's reply, Blackjack turned and walked into the tent, leaving Frank standing there, stewing beside the fire. Frank watched, his hands clenched, his jaw clenched in anger. "He doesn't understand," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the fire. But slowly, his anger subsided. Frank sighed, then muttered to himself, "We're not getting anywhere with this tonight. Better go to sleep." He put out the fire, walked back to his tent, leaving the night in a tense silence. They both knew that tomorrow they would face the biggest decision of their lives. Frank lay in his sleeping bag, eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling. Blackjack's snores echoed steadily, like hammering in his mind. He tried to close his eyes, telling himself that sleep would come soon, but instead, the thoughts echoed in his head like a never-ending stream. Why doesn't he understand? This is our chance to change everything. Frank turned back and forth, his sleeping bag rustling. His anger was rising. Blackjack is stupid, he thought, his eyes now cold. Why would he want to ruin everything? He'll tell LaFay, and then we'll have nothing. He's not a friend. He's a hindrance. The thoughts in Frank's head grew darker, each cycle strengthening his resolve. As the fire outside the tent slowly died down, the anger inside Frank burned brighter than ever. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Frank sat up. He walked out of the tent without a word. Outside, darkness had settled over the forest. The only light remaining was moonlight peeking through the trees. Frank stood there for a moment, his breath coming in short gasps. His eyes swept over the camp, and his gaze fell on the axe propped up beside the pile of firewood. Without hesitation, Frank took the axe. He gripped the handle, feeling its weight in his hand. "Blackjack," He won't stop. He'll ruin everything. Frank walked back into the tent, his legs heavy as if driven by an uncontrollable rage. He stopped right in front of Blackjack's sleeping bag, looking down at his best friend, who was now just a problem in his mind. Frank raised the axe. There was no room for thought, no room for regret. He slammed it down. The blade went straight into Blackjack's head, the deafening crash echoing in the silence. Blood splattered, staining the sleeping bag. Blackjack didn't wake up, didn't realize what was happening. Frank stood there, eyes glazed, his hand still gripping the axe. The smell of blood filled his nostrils, but there was a strange silence inside him. The anger had dissipated, leaving an endless void. What had just happened could not be undone. Frank sat by the campfire, the flames dancing across his pale face. His hands were shaking, bloody, and his eyes stared down at them as if they belonged to someone else. He muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. What just happened? How could I do this to Blackjack? He was my friend. The words were broken in the night wind, but Frank's mind was racing. Regret and horror were rising, but they were still suppressed by disbelief at his own actions. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to breathe deeply, but the air was filled with the stench of blood. The campfire crackled, mocking him. Suddenly, another sound rang out. Crack! Frank jumped. The snapping of a twig came from the tent. His eyes widened, and he turned to look in that direction. Who's there? Frank screamed, his voice filled with panic, but no one answered. Then he heard it. A hoarse, weak moan came from inside the tent. It wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly animal either. Frank felt his scalp tingle. It can't be, he whispered. Blackjack can't be alive. It can't be. The image in his mind was clear, the axe blade coming down, blood spraying, and Blackjack's head nearly split in two. There was no way anyone could have survived that blow. But the moaning continued. Frank sprang to his feet, his hand unconsciously tightening around the still bloodied axe. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked slowly toward the tent. Every step was heavy, the moaning growing louder. As he approached the tent, Frank bent down and gently pulled back the flap. Inside, the dim light from the campfire filtered in, illuminating the bloody sleeping bag. Blackjack didn't lie still. His body jerked, and a hoarse sound came from his throat, as if he were trying to breathe or say something. Frank backed away, his legs almost giving out. It can't be. You can't be alive, Frank screamed, his voice filled with fear. But Blackjack suddenly raised his head, eyes wide, glaring at Frank in the dim light. Half his face was split open, blood streaming, but those eyes, they were filled with hatred. Frank screamed in panic, backing away from the tent, but his foot caught on a rock, sending him tumbling backward. Blackjack, or whatever had been Blackjack, began to drag himself out of his sleeping bag, toward him. The moans turned into unnatural growls, as if coming from the depths of a tormented soul. Frank scrambled backwards, his hands groping for his axe. Get away from me, he screamed, his breath coming in gasps, as the darkness of what had been Blackjack closed in on him. Terror followed, along with a sickening sound that shook Frank's mind. He began to hear whispers, the strange voices he'd caught glimpses of in the woods on his way. But this time, the voices weren't just meaningless murmurs, they were clear, distinct, and they were talking to him. Frank, a hoarse voice said, drawing out the syllables as if it were relishing his fear. You will be tortured for what you did to Blackjack. His heart was pounding, each word a sharp knife cutting into his mind. Frank tried to calm himself. But as quickly as the voices began, they stopped. Everything around him fell into a deadly silence, an unnatural silence, as if the forest had stopped breathing. Frank stood still, his eyes glued to the tent where his friend lay, his mind torn between fear and terrible curiosity. Then the silence was shattered by an unbelievable sound, a blood-curdling scream, echoing from inside the tent. It was not the scream of an animal or any creature he had ever heard before. It was the scream of a man, full of pain, horror, and helplessness. Frank felt his whole body freeze, but his survival instincts forced him to act. He jumped up without hesitation and ran straight for his horse. In his panic, Frank had left everything behind: his gold, his friends, and his tent. Nothing mattered anymore. He needed to get out of here, and he needed to do it now. But as Frank spurred his horse into a gallop through the woods, the whispers returned, more haunting than ever. They seemed to tease, taunt, and follow him in the darkness. In addition, he heard heavy footsteps behind him, as if someone or something was following him. The footsteps grew closer, heavier, and more threatening, making him feel as if at any moment an invisible hand would grab him. Frank did not dare turn around. He knew that if he did, he might see something he never wanted to see. Instead, he could only hunch back in the saddle, urging his horse to run as fast as he could, ignoring everything else. Time seemed to stretch on forever, and he felt as if he were being pursued not by humans, but by something otherworldly, something not of this world. As he reached the first step, Frank felt an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. His breathing quickened, his wild eyes scanning the space before him. The village was eerily quiet, no sound except the wind rustling through the trees and his own footsteps. The church stood there, towering like a symbol of salvation, but there was something cold and distant about it too. The heavy wooden doors were closed, but the dim light from the stained glass above the windows suggested that the interior was not entirely empty. Frank, trembling and doubtful, placed his hand on the door. The coolness of the wood startled him. Maybe this is where I'll find peace, he told himself, though he didn't believe it himself. He pushed the door open, the creaking of its hinges echoing in the silence. Inside the church, the pale yellow light from half-burnt candles illuminated the main path to the altar. No one was there. Everything was so quiet, it was almost surreal. Frank walked slowly inside, his muddy shoes leaving marks on the old wooden floor. He knelt near the altar, clasped his hands, and began to mumble a prayer, though he had long since forgotten how to pray properly. "Forgive me. Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. But then the atmosphere in the church changed. The sense of security he had been hoping for did not come. Instead, a cold shiver ran down the back of his neck. Frank whirled around, but there was no one. He stared into the darkness at the back of the church, where the candlelight could not reach. Suddenly, a voice rang out, soft as a breeze but full of authority. "Frank, do you think you can escape your sins?" His eyes widened, his hands gripping the edge of the altar. The voice was clear, but no one appeared. Frank stammered, Who is it?" But instead of a reply, familiar sounds from the dark forest began to echo: footsteps, whispers, moans. They echoed from every corner of the church, making Frank feel as if the space was closing in on him. In desperation, Frank screamed, "Please leave me alone. I want nothing more but forgiveness." A cold laugh rang out from nowhere, and the voice replied, "Forgiveness? No, Frank. Forgiveness is not for the likes of you, but you will get what you deserve." At that moment, the candles went out, and darkness filled the room, enveloping Frank. The priest listened to Frank's desperate pleas, initially skeptical. However, as Frank began to tell the story of Blackjack and what had happened in the woods, a strange light flashed in the priest's eyes. He was no longer focused on Frank's repentance or his fears, but was fascinated by the idea of gold, a vast fortune buried somewhere in the dark woods. Frank, trembling and panicking, did not notice the change in the priest's demeanor. He continued, "Father, you have to help me. I can't take it anymore. Blackjack, he wouldn't let me go, even after I ran away. He'll kill me." The priest nodded slightly, trying to hide his confusion, but in his mind, he kept picturing the shiny gold bars. Greed, a feeling he had always thought was foreign to him, now filled his mind like a smoldering fire he couldn't extinguish. "Frank," the priest said, his voice trying to sound calm, "tell me the whole story. I need to know exactly where you saw the gold and how you got there." Frank looked at him, eyes brimming with tears, surprised by his strange focus on a detail he thought was not the point. "Don't you understand? I don't care about the gold anymore. I just want to live." But the priest, overwhelmed by greed, only muttered, "No, no, son. Your salvation lies in facing the truth. If you don't go back there and clear things up, you'll never be free of this obsession." Frank shook his head violently. "I can't go back. I can't. Don't you see? He'll kill me." The priest put his hand on Frank's shoulder, but not to comfort him, but to instill in him a false sense of responsibility. "Listen, Frank. Trust in God's guidance. If God has brought you here, it's a sign that you must go back to where you started. And I'll go with you. We'll work it out, and you'll be safe." Though still filled with fear, Frank began to be convinced by the priest's assurance. What he didn't realize was that the priest wasn't interested in his salvation, but only in obtaining the treasure he had told him about. John McDougal, with the calmness of a man accustomed to the harshness of nature, quickly completed the task assigned by the priest. He dug a shallow hole near the campsite, where Blackjack's lifeless body would be hidden from the eyes of the world. Then John placed Blackjack's body in it, carefully covered it with dirt, and erected a large stone as a false tombstone to avoid anyone accidentally discovering it. When the job was done, John returned to the church to report. The priest was waiting, his eyes full of anticipation. As John recounted everything about the campsite, about Blackjack's brutal death, and how he had disposed of the body, the priest showed no signs of horror or concern. Instead, he smiled softly, almost with satisfaction. "Very well, John," the priest said, his voice low and meaningful. "Now there is nothing to hold us back. It is time to take what is ours." The next day, the priest and John set out into the woods, carrying gold mining tools and enough food to last a few days. They followed the directions Frank had inadvertently given them. The priest's mind was filled with visions of shining gold wealth that he believed would change his life forever. When they reached the campsite, everything was still there, except for Blackjack. However, a strange atmosphere hung over the place, as if the jungle was whispering secrets they were not supposed to know. The priest, now completely controlled by greed, paid no attention to the unusual signs. He ordered John to start digging around the area Frank had described. However, as the sunlight began to fade and darkness enveloped the forest, strange sounds began to be heard. Faint whispers, footsteps that seemed to be weaving through the treetops, and, occasionally, cold laughter echoed through the air. John paused, his eyes filled with worry. "Do you hear anything?" The priest frowned, trying to keep his composure. "It's just the wind, John. Don't let our minds wander. Continue." But the sounds weren't wind. They grew clearer, closer, and more terrifying. The darkness seemed to be moving, as if something alive was stalking them. Suddenly, John screamed, pointing into the darkness. "Father, look!" The priest turned, and his heart stopped. In the darkness, a shadowy figure appeared, a ghost with empty eyes and a face twisted in pain. Blackjack! The priest grasped the cross around his neck, but in that moment, he realized that the power of faith could not erase the sins of greed. Blackjack pointed at them, and in a creepy voice, he whispered, "The gold is not yours." The ghost began to draw closer, and the priest and John realized that they had awakened a nightmare greater than any treasure could bring. They could not let this murder be exposed. If the truth were revealed, the officials would immediately come to the scene to investigate. And then they would discover the gold mine, something they could not let happen. So John had to deal with the situation, despite the uneasiness that surrounded him. John began digging a grave for Blackjack. As the shovel sank into the ground, turning up pieces of dirt, he suddenly felt something strange. Suddenly, vague whispers rang out around him. He raised his head, looking around the dense forest covered in darkness. He was alone, at least. That was what he believed. The trees stood still, as if they were watching him. He felt invisible eyes following his every move. John took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and continued digging. But the whispers did not disappear. On the contrary, they grew louder, as if someone was approaching him. The whispers had an eerie intonation, unclear words, but enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. John, a seasoned outdoorsman, was used to being alone in the wilderness, but this time he felt an inexplicable fear. However, he had no choice. He forced himself to continue, his hands shaking but still agile. After finishing digging, John grabbed Blackjack's body and placed him in the grave. He quickly covered it with dirt, then placed a few large stones on top, creating a temporary grave. But even when it was all done, a sense of unease lingered. The whispers were still there, as if they were taunting him, watching his every move. Still, John carried out the next part of his plan. He headed for the stream where the gold was said to lie. When he reached it, he bent down, running his hand through the cool water, searching for any sign of treasure. But then the whispers came back clearer, echoing through the air. This time, they were no longer vague. The words were dark, as if they were coming from the earth itself, from the trees, from the water. John felt as if the forest were alive, screaming at him. He stood, his heart pounding, feeling trapped in a strange and terrifying world. He wondered, were these voices from the past, from forgotten souls, or were they nature's punishment for insatiable greed? John spun around, his eyes scanning the dense foliage, but no one appeared. It felt like invisible figures were slipping through the darkness, avoiding his gaze. And then a high, eerie laugh rang out from the woods. It was not the laugh of a normal person. It was sharp, cold, as if it took the breath away from John. He whipped his eyes around, his hands tightening on the reins, but still saw no one. Unable to bear the rising fear, John gave up his search for gold. He jumped on his horse, kicked his legs, and galloped away as if the forest were chasing him. Over the next few days, John and the priest convinced themselves that the strange things he heard, the whispering, the eerie laughter, were just natural sounds. Perhaps they were just the cries of strange birds, or the sounds of his tired mind. But no matter how they tried to explain it, one undeniable truth remained in John's mind: gold. The allure of treasure was always there, like a sweet whisper in his ear. The gold was there, waiting to be found, and John knew he couldn't resist the pull. This time, John decided he wouldn't go alone. He gathered a group of trusted men, prepared them, and led them back into the mysterious forest. The group slowly made their way down the trail, their footsteps and whispers mingling with the rustling of the wind through the trees. Finally, they reached the area where John had camped last time, but as he stood there, John froze. The large stones he had placed over Blackjack's grave were gone. The grave was empty, as if it had never existed. The bloody tent where Blackjack had been killed was gone as well. There was no trash, no footprints, nothing to show that this had ever been their campsite. John couldn't believe his eyes. This was a completely isolated part of the wilderness, unknown to anyone but him and his companions. But now it was as if the area had been wiped off the map, or had never existed. The group stood in silence, a chill creeping into their every breath. One of the men spoke up, his voice shaking. "Should we continue?" John didn't answer right away. His mind was racing with unanswered questions. Who moved the rocks? Who cleared the campsite? Or worse, was the forest alive, and it had erased all traces? After a moment of silence, John gritted his teeth and said to the group, "Go on! The gold is here. We'll find it." But in the back of his mind, John couldn't help but think, perhaps he and his group had entered a place that didn't belong to this world. No one in their right mind would stumble across this area, pick up the huge rocks and the bloody tent, and then disappear without a trace. It was absurd, inexplicable. John stood in the middle of it, a sense of helplessness and confusion taking over his mind. Who could have done this? And why? Until this point, John had convinced himself that everything he had experienced the previous time had been a hallucination. Perhaps it was just the birds, or the natural sounds of the forest, that his tired mind had turned into something more terrifying than reality. The priest, who had been John's companion, had also dismissed Frank's original story about the ghost of Blackjack, the thing Frank believed had driven him from the forest. To the priest, it was just the ramblings of a guilt-ridden lunatic who had made up a story to avoid responsibility. But now, as John stood before this empty scene, everything changed. John couldn't help but think that perhaps this place really was haunted. The air seemed thick and cold, and every sound in the forest seemed to stop to listen to his shaky breathing. Once again, John turned and ran. He and the men in the group hurried out of the forest as fast as they could. No one dared to look back. When he returned to town, John did not seek out the priest for advice or help. Instead, he headed straight for the bar. John began drinking constantly, as if trying to erase the terrifying memories of the forest. But instead of alleviating his fear, the alcohol only increased his despair. Within days, John died of alcohol poisoning. John's death set off a series of unexplained disasters, all connected to the mysterious treasure. The priest, upon learning of John's death, did not take the time to grieve. The loss of his friend did not deter him from his quest for the gold. Instead, he hurriedly prepared his horse and headed back into the forest, determined to find the treasure. John had risked his life to pursue. However, the trail leading to the campsite and the gold that everyone ventured to find was destroyed in a massive forest fire. It seemed like everything ended there, but not everyone was willing to give up on the dream of gold. Lafayette French, a wealthy investor who funded the original expedition, could not sit still when he heard about the mysterious gold mine. Greed and curiosity drove him to set out on his own trip to find the treasure. However, from the beginning, everything was against him. The guide he hired to lead the way through the forest died mysteriously before they reached the target area. Rumors of Blackjack Ghost and the curse surrounding the forest made everyone around him even more afraid. But Lafayette French did not let those stories discourage him. Like Frank, the priest, and John before him, the gold seemed to have an irresistible power, pulling him deeper into his obsession. For 30 years, he returned to the woods again and again, persistently searching for the treasure. Despite warnings and tragedies that had befallen others, Lafayette French eventually claimed to have found the mine. At least, that was what he wrote home in his final letter. But the truth was never confirmed. On the same day he sent that letter, Lafayette's cabin burned down in a mysterious fire, and he died before revealing the exact location of the mine. Lafayette's death only reinforced the belief in the curse. It is rumored that Blackjack's ghost continues to haunt the woods, preventing anyone from finding the treasure again. Today, the area remains shrouded in mystery. Locals claim to have heard strange noises and seen shadowy figures when they pass through the area. Whether or not the curse and the ghosts are real, one thing is certain: no one since Lafayette French has ever found gold, or even ventured far into the woods to try their luck. The curse, real or imagined, still holds the secret of the mine, buried deep underground forever. Have you watched most of my videos on YouTube? If you are a regular follower, eagerly waiting for new videos each week, I want to say a big thank you for joining me on this journey. Today, you are in luck because we are going to explore something very special and interesting. Something that I am sure will surprise you.